Russia, 1812. Napoleon invaded his former ally with the largest army Europe had ever seen. But for the French emperor, the decisive blow, frustratingly, remained out of reach. Russia's fierce resilience was unlike anything he had ever faced before, and when winter descended, his army began what would become one of the most infamous retreats in military history. In 1807, following victory over the Russian army at Friedland, Napoleon traveled to Tilsit to meet Tsar Alexander. In this historic encounter, the two emperors formed a friendship and an alliance. But it didn't last long. Over the next 5 years, relations between France and Russia quickly deteriorated. The Russians were angered by Napoleon's creation of the Duchy of Warsaw in Poland, which they saw as a provocation on their doorstep. They feared it might pave the way for a fully restored Polish state, a historical rival of Russia. Napoleon also proposed marriage to Alexander's sister, Duchess Anna Pavlovna, to cement their alliance. But the Romanovs were deeply opposed. After a year of delays from Russia, Napoleon instead married Marie-Louise, daughter of the Austrian emperor. Later that same year, Napoleon broke another promise from Tilsit by annexing the Duchy of Oldenburg, ruled by the Tsar's brother-in-law. Even worse was the enforcement of the continental system. Napoleon's ill-fated economic blockade designed to strangle Britain's trade. Although Alexander had agreed to join the continental system at Tilsit, it was widely unpopular in Russia and devastated its already fragile economy. When Napoleon learned that Russia was secretly trading with Britain, he was furious. Accusations of betrayal flew on both sides, and both nations began preparing for war. Napoleon knew that invading Russia would be a monumental challenge, especially with over 200,000 troops still tied down in Spain. Nonetheless, in 1811, he began assembling the largest army Europe had ever seen, nearly 600,000 men, though fewer than half were actually French. The rest came from his European allies, Polish forces from the Duchy of Warsaw under Prince Poniatowski, German troops from the kingdoms of Saxony, Westphalia, and Bavaria, as well as units from Italy, Switzerland, the Netherlands, Croatia, Spain, and Portugal. There were even contingents from Prussia and Austria. Former enemies now turned reluctant. Allies, some of these allied soldiers, like the Poles and many Germans, were as reliable as the French. Others, like the Prussians and Austrians, joined unwillingly. Napoleon divided this enormous army into three main forces. The Central Army was under his direct command. The second, led by his stepson Eugene, Viceroy of Italy. The third was led by his brother Jerome, King of Westphalia. Neither of them had much battlefield experience, though one would rise to the challenge during the campaign, and the other would not. On the left flank, Marshal MacDonald commanded the 10th Corps, which included many Prussian troops. On the right, General Schwarzenberg led the Austrian Corps. Another 100,000 men were held in reserve under Marshal Victor's 9th Corps. The Russians initially had only 220,000 soldiers to oppose this massive force, divided into three armies. The First Army under Barclay de Tolly, the Second Army under Prince Bagration, and the Third Army under General Tormasov. Outnumbered 2-1, the Russians still managed to crucial diplomatic victories before the fighting began. Just 3 years earlier, Sweden had fought a war against Russia, losing control of Finland. In a surprising twist, Sweden was now ruled by Bernadotte, a former marshal of Napoleon. But after Napoleon unilaterally occupied Swedish Pomerania, Bernadotte was enraged. He promised Russia that Sweden would remain neutral. Meanwhile, a peace treaty with the Ottoman Empire ended a 6-year war in the south, freeing up more Russian troops. With both flanks secured, Russia could now focus entirely on the coming French invasion. On June 24, 1812, Napoleon's Grand Army began crossing the Niemen River into Russian territory. The force was so vast, the crossing took 5 full days. Napoleon's plan was to advance north of the Pripyat marshes, defeat Barclay's army, while Jérôme pinned down Bagration. Then the French would swing south and encircle the Second Army. He expected the campaign to be over in 5 weeks, but the overwhelming size of the French army convinced the cautious Barclay that retreat was the only option. Prince Bagration, an aggressive commander who often criticized Barclay's delays, reluctantly agreed. As they retreated, the Russians burned villages and crops. A scorched earth policy aimed at denying the enemy supplies. Within 4 days, Napoleon reached Vilnius, but Barclay had already escaped. In the south, Jérôme failed to hold Bagration in place. So when the first corps moved to encircle him from the east, Bagration had already slipped away. Napoleon's brother was caught in a dilemma. Harshly criticized by the emperor and stripped of command in favor of Devout, Jérôme resigned and returned to Westphalia. The campaign was beginning to show serious cracks in Napoleon's planning. Aware that his army would struggle to find food in this barren region, he had arranged vast supply depots and long wagon trains to sustain his forces, but those wagons moved slowly across the muddy Russian roads. Churned to sludge by summer storms, the army often had to pause and wait for supplies, a fatal flaw in a campaign that relied on speed and encirclement. Thousands of young, inexperienced soldiers began falling behind or deserting. Command and coordination also suffered as Napoleon tried to direct a massive, multilingual army 3 times larger than any he had ever commanded. Once known for its lightning-fast marches, La Grande Army had become a sluggish beast. After regrouping at Vilnius, Napoleon resumed the advance. Barclay fell back to Vitebsk, hoping to link up with Bagration, but Devout blocked Bagration at Saltanovka, forcing him to divert to Smolensk. At Vitebsk, Napoleon encountered Barclay's rearguard, but again the Russians escaped after burning everything they couldn't carry. Meanwhile, 300 miles to the south, Russia's Third Army struck and defeated the Saxon the Seventh Corps, forcing Napoleon to divert Schwarzenberg's Austrian forces to support them. By the end of July, Napoleon had pushed 250 miles into Russia, far more than he had planned, and his troops were suffering from the long, punishing marches through the summer heat. Without a single major battle, Napoleon had already lost 20% of his army, mostly from exhaustion, dysentery, and typhus. Of the 250,000 horses he had brought, they were now dying at a rate of 1,000 per day, from starvation and fatigue. These weren't just cavalry horses. They were meant to haul the wagons. Their loss crippled the army's logistics. The crisis of horsepower came just as French light cavalry, Napoleon's eyes and ears, ran into the formidable Russian Cossacks, proud, self-reliant, ruthless, and brilliant horsemen. The Cossacks fought nothing like conventional European cavalry. They shadowed Napoleon's army daily, swooping in to harass isolated targets, then vanishing into the forest before counterattacks could reach them, along with Russian partisans. They raided French supply lines and depots, forcing Napoleon to divert thousands of troops to protect his rear. Even regular Russian cavalry hampered French patrols and scouts, leaving Napoleon dangerously blind to enemy movements and terrain. He paused for 16 days at Vitebsk to rest his troops and reassess his options. He worried about his exposed flanks, but soon received reassuring news. Schwarzenberg had beaten the Russians at Gorodechna and at Polotsk. A Bavarian-led French force had stopped General Wittgenstein, with his flanks secure. Napoleon decided to push towards Smolensk, hoping to force a decisive battle. Barclay was under pressure to stand and fight, from Prince Bagration and from Tsar Alexander, who argued that Russian morale and national honor demanded a confrontation. With both the First and Second Russian armies near Smolensk, Barclay decided to strike what he believed was Napoleon's isolated force near Rudnya. General Platov's Cossacks surprised a French cavalry unit at Inkovo. But after receiving false reports that Eugene's IV Corps was far to the north, Barclay called off the attack. Relieved, Napoleon launched a major flanking maneuver to seize Smolensk and cut off the Russian retreat. The so-called Smolensk maneuver was vintage Napoleon. Using Roth's cavalry to screen his movements, he reached the Dnieper River. On the night of August 13th, his engineers built 4 pontoon bridges, and by morning, his army was across. Marshal Devout led a second column across at Orsha. But a single Russian division under General Navarowski held up the French at Krasny, buying time for Bagration to reinforce Smolensk. The chance for a surprise attack was lost still. Napoleon delayed further, even pausing for a grand parade to celebrate his 43rd birthday. When the assault finally came 2 days later, he launched a frontal attack. 150 French cannons bombarded the city, while 3 French corps attacked its medieval fortifications. The Russians resisted fiercely, but fearing encirclement, Barclay ordered another retreat. As Smolensk burned, the Russians began withdrawing just as the French stormed into the ruined city. Bagration's Second Army retreated first. Barclay's First Army followed, but its rearguard was caught at Valiatino by Ney's Third Corps. General Junot, commanding the Westphalian, the 8th Corps, had orders to cut off Barclay's retreat. But after crossing the river, he did nothing. The opportunity was lost. A furious Napoleon vowed Junot would never become a marshal. The Battle of Smolensk cost 10,000 casualties and destroyed one of Russia's most historic cities. But it settled nothing. After missing another chance to crush the Russians, Napoleon again paused to consider his next move. His men were exhausted and far from home. It was late in the campaign season. He considered wintering in Smolensk and resuming the campaign in 1813. But Moscow was only 230 miles away. A century earlier, Peter the Great had moved Russia's capital to St. Petersburg. But Moscow remained its spiritual and cultural heart, a prize the Russians would surely fight for. Ever the gambler, Napoleon decided to press on. Tsar Alexander had also made his decision. That summer, he underwent a religious awakening and rallied the Russian people, calling the war a holy crusade to save Holy Mother Russia from the Antichrist, after months of conflicting advice. To fight or keep retreating, Alexander appointed General Mikhail Kutuzov to command the Russian army. Though defeated by Napoleon at Austerlitz, Kutuzov had won victories against the Ottomans and was beloved as a true Russian. The 1812 invasion of Russia marked the beginning of Napoleon's downfall, not because of a single battle lost, but because of the unyielding resistance of a nation, the vastness of its land, and the unforgiving grip of winter, from the ashes of Smolensk to the fields of Borodino. This was not just a military campaign. It was a clash of empires, of willpower, and of destiny. Thank you for watching and exploring this dramatic chapter of history with us. If you found this video insightful, please consider liking, subscribing, and sharing it to support the channel. Your support helps us bring more forgotten moments of history back to life. Until next time, stay curious and stay inspired. Kutuzov agreed with Barclay's delaying strategy, but understood that continual retreat was eroding the morale of the army and the nation if Moscow was abandoned without a fight. The psychological blow would be devastating, and so, 70 miles west of the city, near the village of Borodino, the Russian army made its stand. Europe was about to witness the bloodiest single day of the Napoleonic Wars.